"This plane will crash," the captain warned. Then the F-22s called a name from seat 7A. The flight was supposed to be an ordinary one. It was a peaceful Tuesday morning, and Flight 247 had just left the bustling airport of Chicago, heading for a quiet destination on the West Coast. The passengers were settling into their seats. The cabin was humming with the soft noise of the engines, and the flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, handing out drinks and snacks. People were reading their books, listening to music, or glancing out the windows, lost in their thoughts. Among the passengers sat a man named Adam Mitchell, quietly observing the world outside the window. His gaze wandered out to the clouds as the plane soared higher, cutting through the clear blue sky. Adam was a man of few words. He wasn't one to draw attention to himself, preferring the solitude of his own thoughts. But there was something different about today. Something that kept him on edge. Perhaps it was the way the air felt a little heavier than usual, or the sense of unease he couldn't shake. For Adam, flying wasn't something he did just for convenience. It was part of who he was. As a former pilot in the Air Force, he had been in the sky more times than he could count. But this flight felt different. The plane seemed to shake a little more than usual, as if it were battling the air currents. He glanced around, noticing how the other passengers were casually going about their business, unaware of the subtle vibrations running through the aircraft. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but to Adam, it was a signal. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat and adjusted his seatbelt, a habit from years of military training. It was second nature for him to assess the conditions around him. And though everything appeared normal on the surface, Adam couldn't ignore the growing tension in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. As the plane continued its ascent, the overhead lights flickered briefly, then returned to their usual steady glow. The soft hum of the engines filled the air again, but for Adam it only added to the growing sense of unease. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply and trying to calm himself. It was just nerves, he told himself. Flying was safe. But the instinct, that ever-present sense of awareness from his years in the Air Force, was still there. Then came the voice of the captain over the intercom. It was calm at first, a soothing tone meant to reassure the passengers. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We are currently cruising at 35,000 feet, and everything is running smoothly." Adam listened closely, but he knew better than to be lulled into a false sense of security by such words. He had heard the same phrases before, countless times during his career in the Air Force. But then something happened that sent a shiver down his spine. The captain's voice, which had been steady moments ago, suddenly sounded different, more strained, as though something had shifted in the cockpit. Adam's ears perked up. He was trained to listen for such things, to pick up on the slightest change in tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain continued, "we are experiencing some technical difficulties. We are currently assessing the situation. Please remain calm and fasten your seatbelts." Adam's grip tightened on the armrests of his seat. His instincts were screaming at him now. He could hear the faint click of seatbelt buckles all around him as passengers followed the captain's instructions, some of them looking around nervously. The flight attendants, who had been circulating through the cabin just moments earlier, paused and exchanged quick glances. Adam watched them closely. Their calm demeanor was a good sign, but the tension in their eyes was unmistakable. "Technical difficulties?" Adam muttered quietly to himself. He had dealt with mechanical issues during his time as a pilot, and he knew how quickly things could escalate. But the captain hadn't said anything more specific, and that was what bothered Adam. It wasn't like a simple issue with the air conditioning or a minor glitch in the navigation system. No, the captain was talking about something more serious, something that required a level of discretion, something that could put the passengers at risk. The airplane continued its steady flight, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What had been a relaxing journey had turned into a tense waiting game. Adam was no longer just a passenger. His mind raced through every scenario he could think of, every emergency procedure, every step he would take if something were to go wrong. He looked around, trying to assess the situation. The flight attendants were calm, but they were moving with purpose now, their eyes scanning the cabin as they prepared for whatever might come next. Suddenly the plane shook again, this time more violently than before. Adam felt it in his bones, the deep thrum of turbulence that rattled the plane's framework. He could hear the passengers gasping around him, their excitement turning to fear. A woman across the aisle clutched her armrest, her knuckles turning white, while a father held his young child tightly, trying to calm her with whispered reassurances. Adam leaned forward slightly in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he examined the situation. The flight attendants were quickly moving down the aisle again, checking on passengers and adjusting overhead compartments. But something was different now. They weren't just doing their normal rounds. They were preparing for something. Adam couldn't put his finger on it, but it felt as though the entire crew was bracing for impact. Just as Adam was about to stand up, the captain's voice came through the intercom again. This time, there was no attempt to mask the gravity of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again. I'm afraid the situation is more serious than we initially thought. We are experiencing a critical malfunction with the aircraft's primary systems. I need everyone to stay seated and remain calm. We will be making an emergency landing soon. I repeat, stay calm." Adam's heart raced. Emergency landing. The words felt like a punch to the gut. An emergency landing could mean anything from a simple diversion to a dangerous crash landing. The fact that the captain was warning them meant things were likely worse than they seemed. Around him, passengers were whispering in hushed voices. Some were crying softly, while others exchanged worried glances. But amidst the fear, Adam kept his composure. He had been through this before. He knew what needed to be done. His mind shifted into problem-solving mode, every muscle in his body honed for action. He had been trained to handle emergencies, and now he was going to need every bit of that training. As the plane dipped slightly, the fastened seatbelt signs flashed brighter, and the turbulence grew more intense. Passengers were gripping the arms of their seats, eyes wide with fear. Adam glanced up at the ceiling, watching the lights flicker again. He could see the worried faces of the flight attendants now, their professionalism holding them together even as they, too, were anxious about what lay ahead. But then, through all the chaos, something strange happened. A strange, inexplicable calm washed over Adam. In that moment, he knew that there was no more room for fear. Whatever happened next, he would face it head-on, and he would do everything in his power to help the passengers around him. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about getting the plane on the ground safely. This was about surviving. The plane jolted again, and Adam could hear the muffled sounds of the cabin crew talking urgently to each other. But he was no longer focused on the panic around him. His mind was already in motion, calculating every possibility, every move he could make if things went south. As the plane continued its descent, Adam glanced over at the flight attendants one last time. Their calm expressions told him that they were doing everything they could, but deep down, he knew that the fate of Flight 247 wasn't just in the hands of the crew. It was also in the hands of every passenger, including himself. As the plane began to descend, the once calm and collected atmosphere in the cabin started to shift. The sound of the engines, which had once been a soft hum in the background, now seemed louder, more oppressive, and the shaking of the aircraft intensified with each passing minute. The captain's voice had grown more frequent, but still not entirely reassuring. "We are continuing our descent," he announced. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are approaching the nearest airport." Adam Mitchell's grip tightened on the armrests of his seat. The thought of landing was supposed to be a relief, but the way the captain spoke, almost too calm, made it clear that this wasn't going to be any ordinary landing. It wasn't just turbulence. Something bigger was at play, something Adam couldn't shake off no matter how many times he tried to tell himself that everything would be fine. He glanced around at the other passengers. A few of them were beginning to show signs of panic. A man in the row across from him fidgeted with his seatbelt, while a woman in front of him clutched her child tightly, her eyes wide with fear. The child, unaware of what was truly happening, clung to her mother, a sense of comfort in the midst of the unknown. Adam tried to take it all in. The human mind can only handle so much stress before it starts to shut down, and Adam was silently hoping that the flight attendants, with their calm demeanor, could keep the situation from spiraling any further. Adam's eyes moved toward the flight attendants. They were moving swiftly through the aisles now, doing their best to keep passengers calm while silently communicating with each other. Their eyes flickered with concern, but there was a quiet professionalism about them that made Adam believe they had been trained to handle such situations. They were doing everything they could to maintain order in the cabin, but the shaking kept coming. It wasn't like the usual turbulence. This felt different. It felt deeper, like something was wrong with the aircraft itself, and no one knew exactly what it was. Adam had seen his share of mechanical failures in the air, and although none of them had been this severe, he was familiar with the signs of an emergency. The sudden, violent shaking of the plane was one of them. The low hum of the engines was starting to sound strained, too, as if they were struggling to keep the plane aloft. The flashing seatbelt signs blinked with increasing urgency, a sharp reminder that this wasn't a drill. Adam could feel the unease spreading throughout the cabin. He turned his attention back to the window, the once peaceful view now distorted by the turbulent clouds outside. It was impossible to see anything clearly, but Adam knew that it was only a matter of time before they would need to land. The airport couldn't be far now, could it? His thoughts drifted back to his time in the Air Force, when every second mattered in situations like this. He had never imagined that one day, his training would be tested in such a way while sitting as a passenger on a commercial flight. He had always hoped he would never need to use his skills again, but now, in this moment, it seemed that hope was slowly fading away. Adam wasn't the kind of man to panic. His entire career in the Air Force had been about staying calm under pressure, about keeping his wits when everything else around him was falling apart. But even now, as the plane's descent continued, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could stay in the air. If the situation worsened, what could he do to help? He knew he needed to think clearly. There was no time for doubt. The flight attendants had begun moving quickly now, their footsteps echoing in the cabin, but their movements were more purposeful, more urgent than before. Adam's eyes flickered to them again. They were checking on passengers, offering reassurances, but their faces betrayed a certain wariness, as if they, too, were bracing for something bigger to come. The shaking continued. It wasn't just a slight turbulence anymore. The aircraft was visibly lurching as it descended through the turbulent clouds. Passengers gasped as the plane jolted unexpectedly, and Adam could hear a few muffled screams. A woman sitting just a few rows ahead of him gripped the armrests tightly, her knuckles white. She kept glancing nervously at the overhead compartments as if they might fall. In the seat next to Adam, a middle-aged man was trying to calm his partner, but his voice shook as he spoke. "It's going to be okay," he repeated, though there was a sense of uncertainty in his tone that only made Adam more aware of how far they were from any sense of safety. Adam was acutely aware of how helpless everyone seemed in that moment. But he knew that panic could make things worse, that fear could only lead to chaos. He needed to keep his composure for everyone's sake. His mind raced through every emergency procedure he knew, even though none of it seemed to matter now. There was no cockpit to rush into. He wasn't a pilot anymore, at least not in the traditional sense. This wasn't an Air Force mission. This was a civilian flight, and he had no control over it, but his training kicked in. He had learned to assess risks, to make decisions quickly, and most importantly, to stay calm. And still, the descent continued, the aircraft shaking more violently with each passing second. A flight attendant stopped near Adam's row, her eyes scanning the cabin. She gave him a quick, silent nod, then moved to the next passenger. It was clear that everyone, even the crew, was preparing for what could be a rough landing, but Adam had no illusions. He had seen enough in his life to know that rough landings could sometimes be far worse than anyone expected. As the plane lurched again, Adam's attention was drawn to the window. Through the thick clouds and swirling mist, he could see the faint outline of a city below. The airport, he thought, but it looked so far away. Too far, perhaps. He could feel the pressure building in his chest. "We're coming in hot," Adam thought to himself. His instincts were telling him that this wouldn't be a smooth descent. The ground was too far away, and the turbulence was too violent. He had been trained to respond to emergency landings in military jets, but he didn't know if his skills would apply in this situation. There was nothing he could do to help the plane descend more smoothly, nothing he could do to reassure the passengers around him that they would make it. But he couldn't show fear. He had to stay calm. Suddenly, the plane jerked hard to the right, and Adam's heart skipped a beat. It felt as though they were losing altitude too quickly, as though the plane was diving. People screamed, and the sound of panic filled the cabin. Adam braced himself, gripping the seat in front of him as tightly as he could. The thought that this might be it, the end of the line, crossed his mind, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't ready to give in to that fear. As the plane continued its descent, Adam kept his eyes fixed on the flight attendants. Their composure remained impressive, but Adam knew they were on edge too. Their professionalism was keeping the cabin calm, and Adam realized that, despite the terrifying circumstances, their training was making a difference. They were trying to maintain some semblance of order, trying to make sure that the passengers didn't completely lose it. It felt like the longest descent of Adam's life. Every second seemed to drag on. The shaking was relentless, the noise deafening. Passengers were clutching their seats, some of them muttering prayers, others crying softly. Adam had never felt more out of control, but he also knew that there was no room for panic. They needed to land safely, but it wasn't guaranteed. Finally, the plane gave another violent jolt, and Adam felt the first pang of relief. They had leveled out. The descent wasn't as steep anymore, and the shaking was less frequent. But even then, he knew that the battle wasn't over yet. The worst was still ahead. The plane's wheels were now within reach, and Adam's thoughts were consumed with one thing: survival. They had to make it to the ground, and it would take everything they had to do it. The plane's descent seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't just the slow lowering of the aircraft. It was the heavy, tense feeling in the air that made every second feel like a minute. Adam Mitchell sat in his seat, his eyes flickering between the worried faces of the other passengers, the flight attendants rushing past, and the window that gave him a clear view of the storm clouds swirling outside. The shaking had lessened, but it was still there, a constant reminder that they were far from safe. As the captain's voice came over the intercom again, Adam leaned in to listen. The calm tone of the captain, while reassuring, didn't quite hide the strain in his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking again. We are still in the process of making an emergency landing. I need everyone to remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. Please follow the instructions of the flight attendants carefully. We are approaching the airport, but we are not out of danger yet. Please remain calm." Adam swallowed hard, trying to keep the rising panic in check. He looked around at the other passengers. Most of them were silent, their eyes wide with fear. Some were clutching their loved ones, while others had their hands tightly gripping the armrests, hoping for some sense of control in a situation that was rapidly slipping out of their hands. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with anxiety. The woman across the aisle, who had been quietly whispering reassurances to her child earlier, now looked over at Adam, her face pale. He tried to offer her a reassuring nod, but it felt hollow. Nothing could ease the fear that had settled in the air like smoke. In his mind, Adam was already preparing himself for what could come next. There wasn't much time left, and every second that ticked by brought them closer to an unknown fate. Then the plane gave another violent jolt, throwing everyone forward in their seats. A chorus of gasps and small screams filled the cabin. Adam's heart skipped a beat. His military training had kicked in, but even now there was a sinking feeling in his gut. They weren't landing smoothly. This wasn't just turbulence. The plane felt unsteady, as if it was struggling to keep its course. It felt like the ground was still far away, and that terrifying thought crossed Adam's mind again. How much longer could the plane stay in the air like this? Was the captain really in control? Or was this a situation where they were all at the mercy of fate, hoping that somehow, some way, they'd make it out alive? Adam's thoughts were interrupted by another voice, this time not from the captain. "Adam Mitchell, we need your help," came a strange yet urgent voice over the intercom. It wasn't the captain's voice. It wasn't the flight attendant's either. It was the voice of a man, calm but commanding. The words were like a bolt of lightning to Adam's chest. For a split second, he was frozen. How did they know his name? How did they know he was on this flight? The voice continued, "Adam Mitchell, if you're hearing this, we need you to respond. This is a military operation. You have the training we need. We are above you circling, and we are ready to assist you." Adam's mind raced. Military operation? What was happening? He couldn't make sense of the words at first. He looked around, trying to gauge the reactions of the passengers, but no one else seemed to have heard the message. It was as if the rest of the world had gone silent, and all that mattered now was this mysterious communication that had just interrupted the captain's announcement. Military? What could they possibly want with me? Adam thought. His hand was shaking as he gripped the armrest again, trying to steady himself. He had left the Air Force years ago, and since then he had always lived a quiet, civilian life. He hadn't been part of any military operations in a long time. Was this a mistake? Or was there something more to it, something that had brought him to this plane at this exact moment? As the seconds dragged on, the realization hit him like a wave. They were talking to him for a reason. Someone knew he had military training, someone who had access to the aircraft's communication system. And whoever they were, they believed that Adam was the key to surviving this nightmare. His eyes darted around the cabin again, this time noticing the subtle changes in the behavior of the flight attendants. Their movements were more purposeful now, more urgent. They weren't just doing their rounds or offering drinks. They were scanning the cabin, silently assessing, perhaps waiting for something, maybe even waiting for him. Adam felt the weight of their gaze. He was being asked to do something. But what? What could he possibly do in this situation? Another jolt from the plane snapped Adam back to the present. The turbulence had returned, stronger than before. This time it felt as if the plane was descending faster. His breath caught in his chest. It was hard to tell how much time had passed, but it felt like they were rapidly losing altitude. The shaking had become so intense that the overhead compartments above them rattled violently, and Adam could hear items falling to the floor. "Adam Mitchell," the voice came again, more insistent this time. "We need your expertise. We are ready to assist, but we need you to confirm your presence." His heart raced. The fact that they had mentioned his expertise made it clear that they weren't just making a random request. They had been tracking the plane. They knew he was there. But why? Adam's mind was working overtime, piecing together the puzzle. He had always been good under pressure, but this was different. This was bigger than anything he had ever faced. Finally, he made his decision. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for someone else to take control. Adam wasn't just any passenger on this flight. He had been trained for situations like this. He had the knowledge, the skills, and the experience to make a difference. Without wasting another second, Adam unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The flight attendants glanced at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of recognition in their eyes. They knew he was the one they had been waiting for. Adam moved quickly toward the front of the cabin. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no time for hesitation now. He had a mission. And that mission was simple: get to the cockpit, assess the situation, and do whatever it took to get the plane on the ground safely. As he made his way down the narrow aisle, the jolt of the plane threw him off balance. He gripped the back of a seat to steady himself. Passengers were looking at him now, some with fear, some with hope. A few whispered among themselves, but Adam didn't have time to explain. He couldn't reassure them. He had to focus. He had to save them all. When he reached the cockpit door, he paused for a moment, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The door was locked, of course, but Adam wasn't about to let a simple door stand in his way. He reached for the intercom to alert the crew. He spoke firmly into the mic. "This is Adam Mitchell. I'm former military. I'm here to help. Open the door." There was a long pause, then the door clicked open. Adam stepped inside. Inside the cockpit, the captain was pale, gripping the controls with both hands as the plane continued its erratic descent. The co-pilot looked up at Adam, their faces grim. "We've lost control of the descent," the captain said quietly. "We need help now." Adam took a deep breath, his training kicking in. He knew what he had to do, and this time there was no turning back. As Adam stepped into the cockpit, the world outside seemed to fade into a blur of noise and pressure. The cockpit was a small, confined space, and in that moment it felt even smaller. The captain and co-pilot were both busy with their respective tasks, but their faces were filled with tension. The controls in front of them seemed to shake with each violent jolt of the plane, as if the aircraft itself was fighting against gravity. The captain, his forehead lined with sweat, looked over at Adam. "You're Adam Mitchell?" he asked, his voice shaky but still commanding. The captain's eyes were wide with a mixture of disbelief and hope, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone else was in the cockpit to help. Adam nodded quickly, his voice steady. "Yes, I'm here to help. What's the situation?" The co-pilot, a younger man with dark hair, looked up from the control panel. "We're losing altitude too quickly," he said, his voice strained. "The engines are functioning, but something's off. We've tried to stabilize, but the plane just keeps descending." "We don't have much time." Adam's mind raced. He had faced dangerous situations in the past, but this was different. There was a helplessness to the situation that made it feel almost surreal. The lives of everyone on board depended on their ability to get control of the plane, something that was slipping further out of reach with each passing second. But Adam wasn't going to let that stop him. He had been in life-or-death situations before, and he knew what it meant to focus, to clear his mind, and to trust his instincts. "Okay," Adam said, taking a deep breath. "First, let me assess the flight systems." He moved toward the control panel, his fingers moving over the various switches and dials with practiced precision. He could hear the captain and co-pilot murmuring behind him, but Adam blocked out their voices, focusing only on the task at hand. The aircraft systems had to be thoroughly checked. He checked the altitude readings, the speed, and the control systems. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance. The engines were running, but there was a drop in airspeed that indicated something wasn't quite right. A malfunction, perhaps, or a miscalculation somewhere in the plane's systems. But Adam couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. The aircraft was simply not responding as it should. "There's a drop in airspeed," Adam muttered to himself, his mind running through every possibility. "That's the issue. We need to regain lift." The captain watched him closely, still gripping the controls. "How do we fix it?" Adam's mind worked quickly, drawing on years of training and experience. "We need to pull back on the throttle. The engines need to ramp up in order to give us more speed. But we can't just push it too hard. If we do, the plane will stall. We need to find the sweet spot." The co-pilot, still looking nervous, quickly adjusted the throttle. The plane's engines hummed more loudly as the speed increased, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. Adam's eyes darted around the cockpit. There had to be another way. "There's one more thing we can try," Adam said, his voice firm with determination. He turned to the co-pilot. "I need you to engage the emergency air brakes, not fully, just enough to slow the descent." The co-pilot hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls. "Are you sure? That could make things worse." "I'm sure," Adam replied, his voice steady. "We're not going to survive if we keep going down like this. Trust me." The co-pilot nodded, his expression filled with doubt, but he did as Adam instructed. The emergency air brakes were engaged, and immediately Adam could feel the plane slow its descent just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a chance. "Okay," Adam said, his eyes scanning the control panel. "Now we need to adjust the angle of descent. If we keep descending too quickly, we're going to hit the ground too fast. We need to smooth out the approach." The captain and co-pilot exchanged looks. They both knew that time was running out. If they couldn't stabilize the plane soon, they'd be in a free fall with no way to recover. Adam's voice cut through the tension in the room. "We need to get to the nearest airport," Adam said, his mind calculating the best course of action. "But first, let's get this plane stable enough to make it there. We need to focus on one thing at a time." With the emergency air brakes engaged, the plane was at least holding steady. The descent wasn't as rapid, but it still felt precarious. Adam could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the situation pressing on him. But he refused to let fear take hold. He had been trained for moments like this. In the military, it wasn't just about the skill to fly. It was about the ability to stay calm when everything seemed to be falling apart. "Captain," Adam said, "I need you to prepare for a rough landing. We'll be on the ground soon, but it's not going to be smooth. We'll have to go in fast, but we need to keep control." The captain nodded grimly. "Understood." The seconds felt like hours, and Adam knew that they were running out of time. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep the plane in the air, but he knew they had one shot. If they couldn't land it now, there would be no second chances. "We're almost there," Adam said, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Get ready for the final approach." As Adam spoke, he could feel the plane leveling out just a bit more. The speed was stabilizing, but the altitude was still dropping. They were close, so close, but the hard part was still ahead. They had to get to the runway in one piece. The plane wasn't going to hold out forever, and Adam knew that their only chance was to make it to the airport before the aircraft gave out completely. The runway lights began to appear in the distance, faintly glowing in the dark sky. Adam's eyes locked onto them, calculating the final descent. He could feel the pull of gravity against the plane as they got closer to the ground, the final seconds ticking down with unbearable slowness. "Just a little longer," Adam muttered, focusing intently on the controls in front of him. The captain and co-pilot were silent now, both watching him, waiting for him to guide them through the final stretch. He had one goal in mind: to land this plane. To get every person on board safely on the ground. "Prepare for impact," Adam said softly, the words hanging in the air. "We're going in." The plane continued its descent, the ground getting closer and closer. Adam's grip tightened on the controls, his fingers moving over them with precision. He felt the engines responding, the air brakes keeping them stable. It was all about timing now. The next few seconds would decide everything. The wheels hit the runway with a thud, jarring the passengers in their seats, but the landing was controlled. They weren't coming in at a dangerous speed. Adam had done it. They had made it. The aircraft bounced slightly on the tarmac, but it held steady, and the plane skidded to a stop just moments before it ran out of runway. For a long moment, there was silence in the cockpit. The sound of the engines slowly winding down filled the space, and Adam let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We're down," he said quietly. The words felt surreal, almost like a dream. "We made it." The captain and co-pilot looked at each other, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had done it. Against all odds, they had landed safely. Adam leaned back in his seat, exhausted but alive. The emergency landing had been anything but easy, but they had survived. The passengers were safe, and that was all that mattered. Adam had come into the cockpit as a stranger, but now he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the experience. He had helped save lives, and that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The moments after the plane came to a complete stop were a blur of noise, relief, and adrenaline. For a long few seconds, no one moved. The loud hum of the engines slowly faded into nothing, replaced by the silence that fell over the cabin. It was as though time itself had paused, giving everyone a chance to breathe. The passengers, still strapped into their seats, sat frozen, staring at the seatbelt signs and waiting for someone to tell them it was over. Adam, still sitting in the cockpit, let out a slow, shaky breath. His hands were still gripping the control panel, his knuckles white. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no fear anymore, just a sense of intense relief. They had made it. He had made it. Against all odds, Flight 247 had landed safely. The captain, who had been silently working beside Adam throughout the ordeal, finally exhaled, his shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "We did it," he said softly, as if still trying to process the gravity of the situation. The co-pilot, looking both relieved and stunned, nodded silently, still too shaken to speak. Adam turned his head to look at both of them, his lips curving into a small, tired smile. "We did," Adam agreed. He wiped a hand across his face, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of disbelief that lingered. But there was no time to reflect on what had just happened. He knew they still had work to do. "Let's get to the back of the plane," Adam said, rising from his seat. His legs were a little wobbly, his body still adjusting to the fact that it had just been through a life-or-death situation. But there was no hesitation in his movements. He had helped land the plane, but the job wasn't finished. The passengers needed to be reassured, to be told that it was safe to move. The captain nodded, and together they moved towards the cabin. As they walked down the narrow aisle, the sound of murmurs from the passengers began to grow. Some were whispering to each other in disbelief, while others were already calling family members on their phones. Adam heard the words, "Thank God," and "We're safe," being passed along. A few passengers even stood up, still visibly shaken but relieved to be on solid ground. Adam made his way to the front, where a flight attendant was waiting. She gave him a quick glance of recognition, then nodded. "We've got everything under control now, sir," she said, her voice steady. "We'll begin the deboarding process as soon as we get clearance from the ground crew." Adam gave a quick nod of acknowledgement, but his eyes were already scanning the cabin, making sure everything was in order. The flight attendants were moving swiftly and efficiently, guiding passengers to the exits, assisting them as they gathered their belongings. It wasn't long before the cabin was filled with the sounds of people talking, the faint clink of luggage, and the soft murmur of gratitude that filled the air. As Adam walked down the aisle, he could feel the weight of the situation finally settling in. He wasn't just any passenger on that flight anymore. He had been part of something bigger, something that had saved lives. He hadn't been a hero by his own choosing, but he had become one in the eyes of everyone on board. And though he had always believed that he was just doing his job, just applying the skills he had learned, it felt different now. It felt important. The first thing Adam noticed was the sense of calm that had descended on the passengers. The fear had faded, replaced by relief and quiet gratitude. He saw a mother holding her young child in her arms, smiling at him with tears in her eyes. A father clapped him on the back, shaking his hand. "You saved us," the man said. Adam simply nodded, unable to find the words to respond. What could he say? There was nothing heroic about what he had done, only that he had acted when the situation demanded it. As Adam moved through the cabin, the passengers' expressions shifted from panic to something much more comforting: gratitude. People who had been trembling just minutes before were now smiling weakly, their faces softening as they realized they had made it. Everyone had been on edge, unsure of what was happening, but now that they were on the ground, the terror had turned into a quiet, shared relief. Adam took a deep breath as he reached the rear of the plane. He had done his part, and now it was time for the professionals, the ground crew, the emergency responders, to take over. The flight attendants were doing their jobs, helping people disembark, making sure that everyone was in good health and that no one was left behind. Adam knew that he didn't need to be in the way anymore. He had played his part, and now the passengers would be taken care of. When the plane's doors finally opened, the fresh air poured in, a sharp contrast to the stale, recycled air of the cabin. Adam stepped down the steps of the aircraft, his feet touching the ground for the first time in what felt like hours. The cool air hit him like a wave, and for the first time since the flight had started, he felt a true sense of relief. The ground crew was already waiting for them, a line of vehicles ready to assist in any way possible. The paramedics were there, their trucks parked just a few feet away, ready to treat anyone who needed help. But as Adam looked around, he saw that the passengers were walking away from the plane under their own power. There were no serious injuries, no immediate threats. The nightmare had ended, and the relief on their faces was the clearest sign of that. As Adam walked away from the plane, a flight attendant approached him, a small smile on her face. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice sincere. "You were amazing." Adam smiled back at her, though the words he wanted to say wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging the gratitude without needing to explain himself. "I was just doing what needed to be done," he replied, his voice calm. "We all did." The flight attendants exchanged looks, and it was clear that they understood exactly what he meant. They had all worked together, done what needed to be done to bring everyone home safely. The emergency response vehicles were buzzing around the aircraft, securing the area and checking the plane. Passengers were being ushered to a safe area to wait for the buses that would take them back to the terminal. The ordeal was finally over. It had been a terrifying experience, but now it was nothing more than a distant memory. Adam stood there for a moment, watching the scene unfold around him. There were no sirens blaring, no chaos, no immediate signs of danger. It was over just like that. But for Adam, it wasn't just about what had happened on that plane. It was about the connections made in those moments of fear, the bond that formed between strangers when lives were on the line. As Adam moved away from the scene, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from recognition, but from knowing that he had made a difference when it counted the most. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing what was necessary when faced with the unknown. The journey was over, and Adam had done his part. It was time to let go of the tension and walk forward into the quiet, knowing that for today, at least, the world had been made a little safer.